right. Hello, hello. So here's my surprise. I'm officially dressed up as your nurse, Lana, and I'm here to help solve problems. Now, why a nurse? Well, besides the fact that it's kind of fun, and this is emergency intervention Q&A, it's also an emphasis that I am not a doctor. You are a doctor. I'm here just to assist. So we all have innate capacity to be our own doctor, to be our own therapist, to be our own guru. That's not to say that we don't need actual doctors and therapists, but we have a capacity, incredible capacity, to be our own healers. And naturally, we need teachers and other people to share information and to guide us until such time that we become fit enough to become our own guides. Having said that, I should dive into questions directly. So I have a couple of different things here that I'm going to integrate, because some of the questions, even though they seem very different, they could be tackled kind of together. So the first question has to do with somebody who has been really struggling with health, like on and on and on. Like if it's not one thing, it's another. And first, I don't know, Lyme disease, then COVID, and it's like just kind of over and over again, right? So on one hand, I'm not a doctor, but there are certain things that we can do that are real needle movers in our physical health. But I want to approach things from like a more psychological perspective. And that is that our bodies and our minds are deeply interconnected. And like I said before, a big portion of our mind and of ourself is the unconscious. So more often than not, there is interconnectedness between physical ailments that we experience and something that corresponds to that illness on a more kind of mental, psychological, spiritual level. And therefore we have the term psychosomatic, meaning it's something that's, it's some physical ailment that springs from one of these sort of internal sources. So having said that, where did I had my little thing with notes, but I lost. It's okay, it doesn't matter, I know what I'm saying. So when these things are happening, okay, so I'm just gonna back up for a second. We seem to think, we have this kind of idea that our psyche is kind of a unified thing, right? So when you talk about yourself, you have a pretty good sense of who you are, what you like, what you dislike. You kind of have a way to there are certain expectations about your own conduct that you can rely on. However, Jungian psychology and depth psychology and analytical psychology in general shows that this is not so, that our mind is inhabited with countless personalities. On a collective unconscious level, these are called archetypes, and on a personal unconscious level, they're called complexes. So to keep this away from being too theoretical, I'm just going to get down to an example. So like, for instance, a universal archetype would be Dionysus. So Dionysus is Dionysus. Sorry, my horrible, my Serbian accent, Dionysus. So Dionysus, as we know, is a god of wine and ecstasy and grapes and whatnot, right? And he's also a trickster. So he's one way to personify the archetype that likes to sort of dissolve. So if we look at addiction, which is across the board something that we all possess to a certain extent. Like addiction is not just doing heroin and like drinking alcohol. Like there's so many different types of compulsive behavior that fall under addiction. So archetype would be like, this kind of like addiction personified. Let's call it Dionysus. And then complex would fall under the category of an archetype, right? But complex is like our individual personal way of expressing that addiction. So for some of us, it could be like binge eating. For some people, it will be sex addiction or binge watching television, avoidance, things of that nature, right? So we are inhabited by countless archetypes and complexes, which, according to Jungian psychology, are completely autonomous, number one. Number two, they belong, just as ego is kind of the conscious aspect of ourself, the archetypes and complexes are in the unconscious. So even if we do become aware of them, we never really quite grasp the full extent of what they are and how deep they go. And also complexes and archetypes have their own sort of plan or their own track or their own, it's like we as individuals all have goals, and we have some kind of aspirations. Well, so do complexes. And they tend to take us in a direction that sometimes our ego doesn't want to go. So now, okay, let's just wrap that up and get to the point. So having said that, that these sort of inhabitants that live in our psyche, they're plentiful and they have very different fixations and very different plans that, we consciously might have. They happen to show up and interfere with our life. So, for example, just look at like self-sabotage and procrastination. It's like on one hand, you're thinking like, oh, I want to, I have this really nice plan about my life. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z and move in this direction. And then, that's all like nice and well. And then when it comes to doing it, something happens and it's like you can't concentrate. Every time you sit down to study, you get too tired. Like there are all these things that are coming up. And this is an example of a complex. Now, complex doesn't have to be always negative. Even though when they sort of come out, they can manifest in a way that's very much contradictory to how we want to be and how we want to present ourselves. And by the way, let me just put it, complexes and archetypes both follow under the category of a shadow. So, because they live in the unconscious. And so this gives us a little more information about like the shadow. The shadow is not just some sort of stuff that we suppressed. There is like a whole lot of stuff going on in our minds. So in the context of a person who is like repeatedly, so I mentioned that they could be positive and negative. I want to mention that. It's not always like a negative thing. It's not always a problematic manifestation, right? So in the event of a person who is like finding herself to be always sick and always kind of having ailments that prevent her to live the life that she wants to live, my invitation, especially if you're somebody who's tried to do everything to heal and feel better and just things are not working, I would say that there is definitely something going on a psychosomatic level. Now, all these different parts, there are these like, this sort of thing, there are many different places from which we could look at this phenomenon. The NLP has its own way of looking at it, and there is like in Tibetan Buddhism, there is this aspect of an aspect of looking at these things as like our own demons. Again, Jungian psychology calls them complexes and archetypes, right? So there are many different ways of looking at the same thing, and they are all kind of consistent. And for example, in NLP, NLP states that every behavior, NLP is neuro-linguistic programming, right? So this sort of, this methodology or whatever, I can't find the word for it, but this, not methodology, technology. This technology has a view that all behaviors that are generated, especially like the unconscious ones, have a positive intention. So like, for instance, when some part comes up, like self-sabotage or whatever, it's not out to get you and destroy you and mess up your life. There is something in this complex that actually is trying to find balance and is manifesting in this way because it doesn't have a more skillful way of getting what it wants. So one way to approach your issue, in particular, the person who asked me the question, is to try to like ask yourself, what is the positive outcome of having all of these ailments? And I know this is like a really weird way to talk about these things because it's like there is no positive outcome of being sick, but hold on, you know, everything always has a positive and a negative aspect. So like when we're sick, yeah, we're not feeling well and we're stuck in bed, but it gives us a chance to take some rest. So there is like always something that we can, you know, something positive that can be extracted. In the, you know, and let's take like a straight up extreme example, you know, people who like shoot up heroin. Like that's pretty out there. Heroin will ruin your life, right? So, however, you know, people who tend to be drawn towards addiction, this drug in particular, are people who tend to suffer more from depression, anxiety, who have had, you know, serious traumas, who have a lot of pain in their life. So reaching for something as extreme as heroin, even though it kind of shuts your life down on many different levels and makes you kind of unable to really operate properly, what it does, it also shuts down your ability to feel pain, because during that moment of, you know, getting high, you're kind of in the state of bliss. You know, you're separated from your problems, and it gives people relief. So from that perspective, you know, and like I said, that's an extreme example, but this is why, you know, and it's a very irrational thing, because aspects of the unconscious are, it's almost like dealing with an animal. It's like the animal mind. There is no really, it's not a rational part. It's just that part that's, you know, think about like a dog or a deer in a forest. You know, animals, wild animals are drawn by very few kind of instincts. They run towards, you know, what they want and desire, so like food, and they run away from something that they consider danger or, you know, something that feels unpleasant or thing. And then what's the brain farts? Okay, sorry. So anyway, so that's, you know, our complexes operate on that level. So, you know, how would a wounded animal behave? Like if you come to a wounded animal and you want to help it, it's going to try to maybe bite you, even though you're trying to help. Like it doesn't know, it doesn't have a rational kind of mind. So now now we're kind of wrapping it up, right? Because someone also asked me how to there was another person that asked me something about, I didn't write the question. Okay, somebody asked me a question, you know, how do we integrate all these different elements of ourselves? Like how do we, you know, you have a part that's like an addict, and then you have a part that wants to be successful, and then you have the inner child, and then you have, so all these different, like how do you reconcile? Number one is, well, first we have to become aware of them. And like I said, complexes and archetypes, there is always going to be a portion of them that's like way deep, and you know we'll never see the bigger, like the big picture, but at the least we can become aware of them, right? So we first start to see that, like, okay, this is an issue, this is happening, this is part of me, and then the next thing we do is to kind of name it. You know, you kind of give it form, you name it, you kind of give it form, so to speak. You make it more tangible, and then you work on accepting it, because nothing, we can't, you know, unlike this popular kind of idea that like, oh, I'm gonna annihilate the ego. You can't, if something exists in your mind, you can't annihilate it. It's impossible. The only thing you can do is transform it, turn it into an ally. So, for example, in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is a lama. Her name is Lama Tsultrim Leoni. She's one of my teachers, and she took this 11th century practice called Cho, spelled Chod. It's called Cho. As my friend corrected me, I used to always call it Chud. And this practice that there was like a shamanic practice where you, it's a practice of kind of detaching from ego grasping, right? So in this practice, it's kind of pretty out there. It's pretty graphic. So you see yourself, chopping yourself up into little pieces, and you offer yourself to Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, demons, and all sentient beings. So it's kind of like you're using visual imagery, which automatically dips into your unconscious, right? And you're kind of like priming yourself to cut your attachment to your ego, to that which you identify with. And what do we identify with more than our own body, right? So you see yourself kind of using yourself as a food for all sentient beings. Now, Lama Tsultrim took this practice because a lot of Westerners are not down with this kind of, grotesque imagery. And she turned it into this like psychological practice. And I want to bring up this concept because it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. And the idea is that instead of fighting our demons, we're supposed to feed our demons so that we can turn them into our allies. This requires a little bit of diving into feeding our demons. So our demons, it's anything that we don't like about ourselves, that we don't want to accept. So it could be our illness, it could be our reactions, it could be, like unsavory parts of ourselves, shadows, of course, anything that falls under the category of a shadow. And, it doesn't matter like what lens you're looking at it, psychological lens or spiritual lens or, whatever, right? The idea is that you, in order to transform something, you have to see it and you have to accept it. And when you accept it, you sort of engage with it. And, to answer the question of, the person who said, like, how do we satisfy all these different parts? Well, you sit down with them just like you would deal with a conflict that you have with like other humans, right? You sit with yourself and you have a conversation with all of these parts. And because they're kind of autonomous and they have their own agendas and their own fixations, it's almost as if you are kind of having a conversation with someone else. You actually do, but these little roommates, they live in our own mind stream. And this is where we start to dig a little bit and start to like familiarize ourselves with these crazy roommates that live in our head with us and understand like what is it that they want. And when we do that, we're more likely to get at the bottom of like what drives certain behaviors. Not just behaviors, but like symptoms, like in the example of illness. Like, why is it that my body keeps generating symptoms that keep me from living my full life? What is it? It's almost like you can look at these parts as like inherently problematic and blah, blah, blah. But actually, I don't think that's beneficial. I think, and from personal experience, as somebody who's been doing this work for years and years in different forms, right? I actually do believe that because the unconscious is the seat of the higher self, as well as the animal imprints, there is a lot of wisdom that's covered up in confusion and ignorance. And what we do when we sit down with these complexes and, these like demons, right? We start to befriend them. We start to, so for instance, I, for example, had an issue, with self-sabotage and procrastination back in the day. And I'm somebody who, I work in general very hard. Like the moment I have a little bit of time, I put something extra on my plate. So I'm always kind of like working at a high level, studying, like I'm always taking classes, I'm always doing this and I'm training and I'm just like, a million armed or 1,000 armed deity, right? Then I started to understand that like the self-sabotage part that comes up is not my enemy. It's an invitation to find a balance. So how do we reconcile between these parts? We start to negotiate and we start to cooperate. And, for example, I'll say, okay, I have this sort of ambition and goal, but then my self-sabotage aspect is coming up and like stopping me. So then I can have a conversation and I can find the middle way. I can find, you know, a way to satisfy the positive intention behind that sabotaging behavior. And I can find another way to satisfy it. So it's like, if my self-sabotage complex, you know, let's name it. It's good to name these things. I can't remember what I named my self-sabotage complex. But whatever, you could, you know, you could give it a name that describes what it is, or you could just call it Jenny. Whatever, let's call it Jenny, like for the lack of better, you know. So I'm like, okay, Jenny, you know, your positive intention behind, you know, bringing up self-sabotage is that you wanna, you know, you want more balance in your life. So then you start to look at the ways of bringing more rest into your life, bringing more balance, bringing more self-care. And then you will start to find that as you do that, it is less likely to kind of show up, right? So as you're creating balance, so actually these parts are an invitation for us to get to know ourselves, our hidden needs, our unfulfilled needs. Okay. So this is a little bit all over the place. I'm sorry, I'm not like super organized today. So this is, and you know, one of the people asked how to correctly use shadow work. Is there a more efficient way or a method? And this is, you know, this is one way. Like, so shadow work has to do with waking up to things that are semi-conscious or unconscious in ourselves that control our life, right? And one way of uncovering our shadow is by looking at our projections, which I believe probably most of you already know about projections. So, you know, if somebody's behavior is highly triggering to us, it means that we're reacting to something that most likely we personally embody, but we don't want to look at it, right? So it's something that we suppressed, some tendency that we suppressed in ourselves, or it's even like some unfulfilled dream. So if we see somebody, let's say I always wanted to be an artist, but my parents forced me to be a doctor, a nurse. Actually, no, I choose this archetype of a nurse. But anyway, let's say my parents forced me to do something else for a living. So I kind of suppressed this natural need and desire to be an artist. And then when I see somebody else out there pursuing their dreams and like sacrificing other things to pursue that dream, to become an artist, I might, you know, have a judgment for that person. I might get triggered by their behavior. I might say, well, that, you know, that's so irresponsible. Like that's stupid. That's ridiculous. Like anything kind of negative that's fixated on other people, it reveals something hidden about ourselves. And anytime there's an emotional reaction behind our experience, rest assured, it has to do with your complex or your shadow or whatever. So it's really, you know, in this way, other people are like our mirrors. So, you know, shadow work, again, you know, you could work at it through projections. And by the way, just because you, how do I say this? Like sometimes people say that like, oh, well, it's not projection because it's really happening. Yeah, the person might, you know, objectively be doing something problematic. But the reason you're upset, that itself is a projection. You know, it's not to say that like you can't react to somebody's bad behavior or that it's wrong or whatever. It just means that anything that's loaded, highly emotional, it means that there is something inside of you that you need to work through. So, so the projection is one way. So shadow work, so how to, you know, more efficient way or a method to do the shadow work would be to work with your complexes. And there is actually, so like, here are some ways to uncover your complexes. So you can think about like things, because complexes can be both positive and negative, right? You can ask yourself, what do you fantasize about or daydream, or even what do you dream about frequently? You know, what do you dread or find repulsive? what are you very good at? What are you really bad at? What are some things that like you just are not really good at in your life? What are you totally incompetent at? That's the same thing, okay? So by answering these questions, you can start to arrive, or you can start to uncover your different complexes. Like right now for me, what are things that are problematic for you, or any fears or any issues that you might have? So it could be like fear of aging. That's a big one. I'm 42, I don't want to say that I have fear of aging, but that's the kind of underlying quality. There is definitely, I can see changes in myself. I can see that my energy levels are not what they used to be when I was in my 20s. And, there are little things happening to my body, to my, even, my mental capacity. Like I'm starting to get a little bit slightly more forgetful, and decade after decade, this stuff is going up, right? So these are all things that are very universal. Some other things could be, like I said before, binge and self-sabotage. But then what are some positive things? Like for me, and the positive complex would be this like fixation to just study, to just like this curiosity to absorb and to break things down and to analyze and to understand. So you can like start to take aspects of yourself and kind of write down, these or single out these complexes, and then you name them, and then you start engaging with them. You start inquiring within yourself, like, what is the positive intention? What do you want? Like, how can I fulfill, this archetype or complex? And then as we go through the process of befriending different aspects of ourselves, we start to their aspirations and fixations, as they become sort of satisfied, or as we sort of balance them out, we eventually start to get, this is my experience, we eventually get to the place of seeing that what they want is not different from what we want. It's just that they have a different way of getting there. And this is what starts to create a potential for us to become unified within our own mind. And this is what Jung refers to as individuation. We're becoming whole. So all these parts of ourselves that are fragmented, we're starting to kind of put them together, befriend them until we're all kind of like living under one roof with a single aim, that's like wholesome, beneficial, expansion, evolution. So so I think this has been going on for a while. Okay, yeah, it's been about 30 minutes. I'm gonna stop here. There were more questions, but it's just getting to be like too much right now, so I'm gonna save it for the next live. And somebody also asked me about how I relate to my own shadow, and I kind of talked a little bit, right, about that. And, for me, one thing that makes my shadow integration easier is that I'm not somebody who tends to beat herself up. I don't really suffer from guilt and shame much. I think this is probably also a result of doing a lot of work on myself, but it's absolutely possible for all of us. And the more, and this also has to do with like self-compassion and self-love, like the wholesome self-love, right? Because the more we beat ourselves up, the more we kind of create conflict between ourselves and, the ego, and then all these different fragments. So what we want to do is we want to create more peace inside of ourselves. And, it will be really worthwhile to go away with any guilt, any shame, any kind of self-loathing. And this directly correlates to like how judgmental we are to others. Because the more we are judgmental to others, those same voices that force us to kind of fixate on others and kind of gossip and point fingers and kind of undermine, right? Those same voices come back to haunt us when we are in like a bad place. So I think for me, even though, sometimes it's hard to see aspects that I don't like, but my attitude towards the shadow aspect of myself is much more open. It's much more compassionate and more welcoming. And anyway, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I'm gonna stop now. Like I said, it's been a little too... Okay, let me look at your questions, because I never really look at the comments because it always gets me distracted. Actually, no, everybody's waving, but I've seen some questions. What is it? What is what? I don't know. I don't know what point you asked, but anyway, so send me your questions, anything, you know, it really helps me a lot for all of us who are creating content. It's like, there is a lot that we want to say and share, but like at a certain point, it just becomes kind of like, you know, you hit the glass ceiling. So it really helps to hear questions, and it really helps me kind of like spread out and, you know, branch out into like new avenues that are a lot more interesting than if I were just to share something that comes to my own mind. So thank you guys for watching. And oh, and this is, I'm going to take a second to just quickly advertise. I have a course that I created that I spent insane amount of time, energy, and money to create. And I keep postponing the date, but it's launching end of this month, and I'm gonna put up information about that. But it contains everything that I practiced and studied for the course of last 20 years. So just wanna, you know, say that that's coming out. It's very practical. So it's like there are like lessons, and then there's application, you know, putting it into practice. Because getting information is not enough. We have to, you know, put ourselves through the process in order to integrate. Okay. Thank you. Much love to everybody. Happy Sunday. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.